up always reading comics, something I remember reading about pretty frequently is how a set of characters would secretly discuss the main character and note that they'd never find out. Coincidentally, that character being talked about would sneeze or have a sudden itch, as if those people talking about them gave them that sneeze. I also remember reading characters remarking, "Oh my god, that couple is too sweet. They're gonna give me diabetes." Now, maybe the comic community got it a little confused because while no one is sneezing from being gossiped about, nor is anyone getting diabetes from hearing or seeing something really sweet, it turns out the real link is between the sneeze and diabetes. Let me back up. The real link is between the cold and diabetes? Yeah, I didn't misspeak. One of the most well-documented complications of diabetes is actually a weaker immune system. But how? I thought diabetes was just about how your body processes sugar. Well, if you couldn't tell by now, diabetes is a lot more than just our body's ability or inability to process sugar. So let's get into it. There are two main pathways involved in how diabetes tends to weaken one's immune system. And a little hint, they're again related to hyperglycemia. For a little review, hyperglycemia is when someone has prolonged high blood glucose levels, which a diabetic tends to have without knowing, due to their faulty insulin production systems. With that in mind, the first pathway is related to inflammation. Before all is said and done, when I think of inflammation, I usually think of something feeling like it's burning or turning red. But what exactly is inflammation on a clinical level? Well, that feeling is your immune system responding to injury, infection, what have you. And in doing so, the primary actors used by the immune system are inflammatory cells and cytokines, or proteins that regulate this whole process. So really, inflammation can be really helpful sometimes. But when prolonged or activated when unnecessary, inflammation can worsen a host of diseases and even predispose you to others. Returning to diabetes, when someone's blood glucose level is too high for too long, it can set off a bunch of chains of reactions. One increases type 1 interferons, a specific family of cytokines that increase the expression of inflammatory markers. Another chain of reactions that is essential for proper immune system functionality implicates macrophages. Macrophages are a type of immune system fighter that, this time, eats the substances causing injury or illness through a process called phagocytosis. They start off pro-inflammatory in order to fulfill that eating duty, and then become anti-inflammatory as the area heals and the tissue regenerates. However, hyperglycemia can cause a couple of problems for these cells. First, prolonged glucose exposure during hyperglycemia can reduce a macrophage's capacity to produce energy, thereby reducing its ability and incidence of phagocytosis. As a result, debris as well as used up immune system cells called apoptotic cells can build up at the site of an infection, keeping a macrophage in a constant pro-inflammatory state. The second way that hyperglycemia can be problematic for macrophages is by setting off other chemical pathways that reprogram the macrophage to continuously express pro-inflammatory cytokines in the site of insulin producers or in the beta cells in the pancreas. And as a result, this only plunges the source of the diabetes deeper and deeper. Related to inflammation alone, there are at least 5 other pathways that implicate a diabetic's susceptibility to these inflammatory misfires. And for that, I'll link to an in-depth article in the description and on my website so that anyone who is interested can definitely check it out. I really recommend, if this to any extent confuses you or interests you, that this article might be worth checking out. The second primary way that diabetes infringes our immune system's capacities pertains to a heightened susceptibility to infection. Like inflammation, hyperglycemia infringes on several pathways and causes a diabetic to essentially experience more severe infections more frequently. But across a lot of these pathways, there's a common trend and an idea that with diabetes and with hyperglycemia in specific, it reduces a person's ability and effectiveness to recruit immune system cells like macrophages, neutrophils, and granulocytes. Specifically, what this means is that of the already few fighter cells that exist at the site of an infection, only some of them are able to do their job to the best of their ability. Additionally, many diabetics experience microvascular problems such as neuropathy that make it difficult and make blood flow to a site of an infection in peripheral regions even more difficult, making it only harder for your body to bring immune system cells to the site of an infection. As a bonus, there is a third way that diabetes interacts with our immune system, although it's a more widely known association. Type 1 diabetes, more than just an lifestyle disease, is an autoimmune condition that is specifically characterized by the sustained inflammation of the insulin-producing pancreatic islets. Specifically, T cells from the immune system infiltrate the pancreas and mistakenly attack the insulin-producing beta cells. Over time, sustained inflammation combined with the direct attacks from the T cells cause these insulin-producing cells to become damaged and eventually become defective or destroyed. Once this happens, even if partially, the person loses a major source of insulin in their body, as these islets and beta cells are not going to be able to be remade and can fall victim to the hyperglycemia that gives rise to these previous two sources of problems for the immune system. The bottom line is that diabetics don't have it easy when it comes to fighting off viruses, because unlike the average non-diabetic, their immune system is impaired by both inflammatory misfires. While all diabetics experience some level of this immune system deregulation, not all experiences are equal. Let me explain. Over the past couple of years, there have been some especially well-documented instances of diabetes infringing on interactions with given viruses. For the first one, let's take a trip down memory lane and transport ourselves back to 2020. The pandemic has just begun, and families are quarantined within their homes and suited up with N95 masks should they need to go outside. And they do a wonderful job of keeping themselves contained such that no infected persons would be able to come into contact with them. Yet, despite all of this, millions of people still contracted the virus and spread it. So what exactly happened? Well, maybe it's fitting, considering this is a video series about diabetes, that some of this actually links back to the very immune system failings that are linked to hyperglycemia and diabetes. Of course, diabetics already are likely to have immune system failings due to heightened inflammation and a heightened susceptibility to infection. However, what research found during the COVID-19 pandemic took this risk a little bit further. Just about a month after quarantine began in the United States, research and data had already been released indicating a possible correlation between the severity of COVID-19 and whether or not someone had diabetes. Case studies conducted in China and the UK indicated that diabetic patients had a 2-fold to 3-fold greater risk of severe infection, as well as a 2.03 to 3.5 times greater risk of death in the hospital when compared to those that are non-diabetic. In fact, research has shown that COVID-19 as an infection could induce stronger hyperglycemia, putting those dependent on insulin and glycemic control at a higher risk for ketoacidosis. Specifically, when the blood sugar of someone rises above 250 milligrams per deciliter, their body begins burning fat for energy, producing ketones or blood acids, which in high concentrations could poison the body. So, with this in mind, researchers began to spend the following months and years trying to better understand the link between diabetes and the virus that ravaged the earth. In their studies, they came across a molecule that was the missing puzzle piece on both ends of the COVID-19 spectrum: ACE2, or angiotensin converting enzyme 2. On one hand, the COVID-19 organism is such that it binds to ACE2 receptors in human cells in order to begin its takeover process. What they also found was that diabetics tended to have an increased initial expression of ACE2 due to the use of ACE2 inhibitors, or drugs that would prevent any spillover damage during hyperglycemia-induced bouts of high blood pressure to the kidneys and blood vessels. So with this in mind, many made the link that diabetics having an increased rate or initial expression of ACE2 were also having an increased risk and susceptibility to contract COVID-19 and enable its proliferation. On the other hand, however, ACE2 is also an important actor in cells' immune processes, which got me a little confused. Wouldn't increased ACE2 production and expression give diabetics a tool to fight against the virus? Well, in an ideal circumstance, the answer would be yes. But the COVID-19 organism is a little smarter. Once it has used ACE2 receptors to enter a cell and take it over, it tends to begin the endocytosis process, and bite the hand that fed it, or downregulate and reduce the production of ACE2 receptors in these cells. All in all, this pathway makes diabetics especially susceptible to contracting COVID-19 and especially vulnerable to the disease's severity. With COVID-19 out of the way and the general understanding that diabetics often have a more severe engagement with common infections like pneumonia, staph or strep, and the flu, the other main type of viruses that diabetes has a kind of weird relationship with is enteroviruses. The CDC defines enteroviruses, or specifically non-polio enteroviruses, as a viral infection causing a mild illness with symptoms such as those of the common cold, except with the added risk of quick complication. Some of the main types of this include the D6 enterovirus, the Coxsackie virus, and the A71 enterovirus. So really what they mean to say is that enteroviruses are kind of like those really persistent and really annoying colds that never go away. But with enteroviruses, the main problem, especially within the context of diabetes, is that there have been links found connecting enteroviruses and the development of type 1 diabetes inside of a person. We've already understood that type 1 diabetes occurs when your insulin-producing beta cells are destroyed in a bout of autoimmunity, or a loss of self-tolerance. But what exactly causes this autoimmunity? Well, one theory suggests that several viruses, especially when reoccurring over a short period of time, could accelerate the progression of type 1 diabetes in a person. With enteroviruses, namely Coxsackie virus, abbreviated as CVB, the main hypothesis is that viral cells, such as those of CVB, could persist and enter the pancreas and persist there long after the body has finished fighting the infection. What this means is that immune cells are constantly being sent down to the pancreas to fight these persisting cells and could put the pancreatic islets responsible for insulin-producing beta cells at risk for autoimmunity. When tested in various studies where the CVB4 virus was grafted into pancreatic cells to see what the impact of these cells lingering was, researchers found that the proteins of the CVB4 virus quickly took over the microbiome of the test cells, causing ER stress and beta cell dysfunction due to the elevated concentration of toxic proteins. In cells that were previously not diabetic, the non-fasting glucose level was significantly increased, leading to a faster progression of type 1 diabetes in these cells. And finally, if the constant infection in the pancreas wasn't enough, persisting viral proteins made the pancreas more susceptible to reinfection, leading to it to induce chronic inflammation in the islets that are responsible for insulin-producing beta cells, degrading that tissue one way or the other. Now, this all seems kind of scary, because with this knowledge, it sounds like anyone could contract a simple cold, and it has all of these complications associated. However, I'd like to remind you all that while these complications could occur, they're far from being guaranteed and certainly not deterministic. In fact, in a sample of type 1 diabetics, it was found that only about 2 in every 11 diabetics were suspected to have viral interference in the progression of their diabetes. So safe to say, this is just another one of those things that contribute to everything that a diabetic has to face. But on that note, that's all from me today. As always, all of the references that I used, additional reading material, and the transcript of this video will be listed on the According blog on my website, which will be linked below. Thank you all for learning alongside with me. I hope you learned something new today, and I'll see you next time.